In October 1347, officials at the port of Messina in Sicily stood waiting for 12 Genoese trade ships returning from the Black Sea. They were expecting hulls packed with valuable silks and spices. Instead, the ships drifted quietly into the harbor. When port authorities stepped onto the decks, they found no treasure. The wooden planks were scattered with the dead. The handful of sailors still breathing were covered in large, black, apple-sized boils, called buboes, that oozed blood and pus. The officials immediately ordered the ships back out to sea, but the damage was already done. The true culprit was already on shore, Yersinia pestis, a single-celled bacterium completely invisible to the naked eye. This was a biological wrecking ball that would systematically dismantle the foundations of medieval society. To find out how it reached Sicily, modern science had to trace it back to its source. In 2022, researchers extracted DNA from the teeth of victims buried in the 1330s near Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan. Inside those teeth, they found the exact ancestral strain of the plague that would later devastate Europe. From those cold Central Asian mountains, the pathogen traveled west. By 1346, it had infected the massive Mongol army of the Golden Horde, who were locked in a grinding siege against the trading port of Kaffa in modern-day Crimea. Dying from the disease and facing defeat, the Mongol commanders loaded the infected corpses onto catapults, launching them over the city walls. It was a highly effective terror tactic. The disease rapidly swept through the city, prompting panicked Genoese merchants to flee by sea. They packed up their ships and unknowingly carried infected rats and fleas right along with them. A military maneuver initiated the outbreak, but the extensive, interconnected global trade network served as the perfect delivery system, transporting mass death directly into the dense, filthy population centers of Europe. Europe in the 14th century was entirely defenseless. No one understood germ theory. The scientific consensus was that diseases were spread by miasma, or bad, foul-smelling air. We now know the plague manifested in 3 biological stages. First, bubonic plague, transmitted by flea bites, which carried a 60% mortality rate. If the bacteria bypassed the lymph nodes and multiplied straight into the bloodstream, it became septicemic plague. The final mutation was the deadliest. When the infection reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague. It was now airborne, spreading from person to person through coughs and sneezes, carrying a mortality rate that essentially guaranteed death. Today, we associate this era with the iconic plague doctor masks. But these were designed 300 years later. Doctors in 1347 had no protective gear, relying on cutting open infected sores or applying leeches, procedures that usually accelerated death. Between 1347 and 1351, the bacterium wiped out between 30 and 60. Debtors and local leaders spread rumors that Jewish populations were poisoning the wells, leading to horrific mass executions across the continent, ignoring the Pope's warnings that Jews were dying of the plague at the exact same rate. At the same time, the disease was ravaging major Islamic centers like Cairo and Mecca. The social response there was starkly different. Islamic scholars generally framed the disease as divine will or an opportunity for martyrdom, and largely avoided violently scapegoating minority groups. With no cure in sight, survival required a completely new administrative strategy. Port cities like Venice and Ragusa realized that since they couldn't treat the sick, they had to isolate the ships. They enacted strict maritime laws, keeping incoming sailors anchored out at sea. They mandated a 40-day waiting period before anyone could step ashore. In the local Italian dialect, this 40-day isolation was called quarantino. By starving the bacteria of fresh hosts, systematic isolation became humanity's first reliable weapon to break a pathogen's chain of transmission. The massive loss of human life left behind thousands of empty farms and an unprecedented labor shortage. Suddenly, there were far more jobs than people. Surviving peasants, who were once tied to the land as serfs, suddenly held immense leverage. They began demanding actual wages for their work, a shift that shattered the medieval feudal system and seeded early capitalism. For centuries, the church held a monopoly on explaining the world and providing spiritual protection. But when the plague killed the clergy as efficiently as the commoners, that religious shield was revealed to be an illusion. This vacuum shifted the medieval focus from divine will to human observation, creating the psychological space where the Renaissance would eventually take root. And the bacterium wasn't finished rewriting history. When the third major plague pandemic arrived in Bombay in 1896, the British colonial government enacted severe, oppressive disease control laws. British officials violently invaded homes in the name of sanitation, deeply offending local religious and cultural sentiments. This heavy-handed response triggered political assassinations and became a major catalyst for the Indian independence movement. From medieval serfdom to British imperialism, the bacterium repeatedly acted as a global sledgehammer, tearing down entrenched power structures century after century. The legacy of the Black Death is currently active inside the cells of millions of people living today. Survivors of the outbreak pass down a mutated gene variant called ERAP2, giving their immune systems a massive advantage. But the survival comes with a trade-off. That same aggressive immune response makes modern descendants highly vulnerable to autoimmune disorders like Crohn's disease. The plague itself still exists today, with minor outbreaks occurring from Madagascar to the United States. We now have antibiotics to treat it, but the constant threat of drug resistance means history could easily repeat itself. These pandemics act as brutal architects of the modern world. By dismantling old systems to make room for the new, they reshuffle global labor, topple empires, and leave a permanent signature in human DNA.